Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
It started on one of those evenings that should have been nothing more than a pleasant blur of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and too many dishes competing for space on my parents' oversized dining table. But instead it became the night my entire family finally pushed me to the edge. My brother David sat at the head of the table like he always did, not because anyone asked him to, but because he simply assumed it was his rightful place. He had been doing that since we were kids, claiming authority with the kind of smug confidence that made others step aside without even realizing they were giving something up. That night, as the wine flowed and the conversation wandered between safe topics like football scores and the stock market, I knew the moment would come when his eyes would settle on me and the room would tilt into another one of his performances. He didn't disappoint. After my mother made some half-hearted attempt to ask how my little projects were going, David smirked across the table as though the question had been a setup for his punchline. Projects, he repeated, rolling the word in his mouth as though it tasted ridiculous. That's what you call it now? When most people your age are running departments or at least have something to show for themselves, you're still dabbling around like it's summer camp. His words landed with the force of habit, like insults rehearsed over the years until they came naturally, sharp enough to wound, but polished enough to pass off as casual banter. The others chuckled, some nervously, some in genuine agreement, and I felt that familiar burn rise from my chest to my throat. I could have said something then. I could have told him that what I had been building quietly behind the scenes was more substantial than anything he could imagine, that the hours I had spent in silence were not evidence of failure but proof of patience. But when the laughter rippled around me and even my father shook his head with a smile, I understood that my words would only bounce off the wall of assumptions they had constructed around me. To them, David was the success story, the golden son, the one who could make deals over golf games and walk into a room already certain he belonged. I was the shadow that trailed behind him, tolerated but never celebrated, the one who had to prove her worth twice over just to earn half the recognition. David leaned back in his chair, pleased with himself, and continued. Don't take it the wrong way, he added, feigning generosity as he speared another piece of steak, but not everyone is cut out for big things. Some people just aren't built for pressure. And that's fine. We all need people who can accept their limits. His voice dripped with that poisonous mix of condescension and false kindness, the kind that bruises worse than an outright insult because it pretends to be advice. My mother tried to change the subject by asking if anyone wanted more wine, but the damage had been done. The table had split into two camps, those who looked down awkwardly into their plates, and those who looked at me with the kind of pity that made my skin crawl. I didn't answer him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I forced myself to chew slowly, to place my fork gently on the plate, to keep my breathing steady even though my hands trembled under the table. I smiled, or at least something close enough to a smile that no one could accuse me of sulking. But inside, something shifted. For years I had tolerated these moments, collecting them like sharp stones in a pocket, telling myself that one day they might add up to something. That night, the pocket finally tore open. When dessert was served, David launched into another story about his company, how he had just secured a new client, how his team was expanding, how proud our parents must be to see him carrying the family name into real success. He glanced at me during the story, just long enough to remind me that his version of success was the only one that counted. I excused myself early, claiming I had work to do, and walked out into the night air before anyone could stop me. The chill was sharp, but it cleared my head, and as I slid into my car and gripped the steering wheel, I realized I had no desire to defend myself anymore. What David never understood, and what my family never cared to notice, was that silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes it is the sound of someone sharpening their focus while everyone else laughs. I had listened long enough, endured long enough, waited long enough. That night, as the echo of his laughter still clung to me, I decided that words would no longer be my weapon. I didn't plan to humiliate him at another dinner or prove him wrong with a list of my accomplishments. That would have been too small, too temporary. What I wanted was something permanent, something that would strip away his smug certainty and show him what it felt like to sit in a room where every smile was pity and every silence was condemnation. I wanted to take from him the one thing he valued above all else, the thing that made him feel untouchable. So I drove home in silence, the road stretching out in front of me like a promise, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan had already taken root. David thought I was a failure, and maybe that was my greatest advantage. Because when someone underestimates you for long enough, they never see you coming. That night, I realized I didn't need to fight him with words. I had something far more powerful. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with the taste of overcooked roast and humiliation still clinging to the back of my throat, and while the house was quiet and the coffee machine coughed out that first reluctant stream, I did something I had not allowed myself to do in years, which was to replay the highlight reel of our family mythology without the flattering edits that usually protected the hero. Because when the volume of memory is turned up high enough, you start hearing the parts that were always there but politely ignored, like how David's report cards were taped to the refrigerator with gold stars while mine lay buried under magnets from road trips we never actually took. Or how his Little League trophies got a dedicated shelf and a dusting routine while my debate ribbons were folded into a drawer that smelled like lemon cleaner and resignation. My brother learned early that attention is a currency, and he spent it with loud confidence, while I learned that invisibility could be a savings account if I waited patiently enough, and although I did not have the loud applause of boardrooms or the easy banter of golf course deals, I had something that made me steadier than he realized, which was the muscle memory of doing things quietly and doing them well. It helped that I had already built the kind of life that never looked impressive in family stories, but paid real, boring dividends when no one was watching, a life made of side contracts that grew into steady clients. Investments that were not sexy enough to brag about at Thanksgiving but kept stacking, and a habit of reading the footnotes that other people skipped because they were in a hurry to celebrate the headline, and out of that steady, unglamorous discipline came a second habit that turned out to be my most valuable one, which was noticing patterns, the tiny repetitions that betray bigger truths. When David bragged about his company's expansion and tossed around words like aggressive growth and premium clients, his mouth made the right shapes, but the details snagged, because the same projects kept reappearing under different names. And the new client he claimed to have secured had already been on his website for longer than a single quarter, and the open roles he flaunted on social feeds looked suspiciously like backfills dressed up as a hiring spree, and suddenly I could see the outline of a castle that had been painted to look like stone, but was really plywood and spray adhesive. I did not decide to get even in a burst of anger, because sharp words are satisfying for 5 minutes and then leave you thirsty, and I did not fantasize about humiliating him at the next holiday, because public victories are noisy and surprisingly fragile, so instead I made a list on the back of an old envelope while the coffee went cold, a plain list with 3 columns that would have made my high school math teacher proud, labeled information, leverage, and timing, and the first item under information was the most unglamorous task imaginable, which was to read everything, not just headlines, but the legal filings that live in tedious databases. Not just glossy case studies, but vendor complaints that sit in comment sections like abandoned shopping carts, and not just the glowing press releases, but the departures that show up on professional networks at inconvenient hours on a Friday night. By the time lunch rolled around, I had found exactly what I needed to pivot from wounded little sister to disciplined opponent, which was not a smoking gun, because life rarely offers those, but an accumulation of smoke in too many rooms to be an accident. Delayed payments to a regional logistics firm, a lien that appeared for a week and then mysteriously vanished, a glassy statement from a senior account manager about spending more time with family, and a string of reviews that all mentioned the same 2 phrases, Monday pipeline panic and revolving door at the top. I started with something small because small moves give you practice without setting off alarms, and because clever revenge tastes better when it is plated as an appetizer rather than a last supper. So I reached out to someone who had once been the smartest person in his operations bullpen, a woman named Gabriella who had interned with me years ago before she chased the kind of title that photographs well through glass conference room walls. And I asked her if she wanted to meet for coffee at a place far enough from their office that no one would wander in with a laptop and a nervous smile. She arrived with that drained look people get when they have been carrying water uphill for someone else's parade, and after 2 sips she told me the thing I had suspected but needed to hear said out loud, that David's great machine ran on panic and personality. That every Monday began with a sermon about urgency, that contracts were being renewed at thinner margins, and that payroll had quietly shifted from predictable rhythm to anxious arithmetic. I did not push, I just listened, because people who have been ignored will eventually tell you the truth if you give them time, and when she finally stopped twisting her napkin into confetti, I slid across a folder that contained a proposal for a job that did not yet have a name and a paycheck that respected the part of her resume no one in that building bothered to read, which was the part where she saved failing projects without fanfare. The revenge I served that week was almost polite, a whisper rather than a slap, but it landed with the exact pressure I wanted, because when Gabriella handed in her resignation on a Wednesday afternoon that looked like any other Wednesday afternoon, the first real crack appeared in the pretty paint, and by Friday the messages had started, colleagues pinging to ask if I had really taken her and whether I was hiring anyone else, which, of course, I was. I did not gloat, I did not send a single triumphant text, I simply bought a ridiculous sheet cake from the big warehouse store with the fluorescent lights, and had them write in looping frosting, "To New Beginnings." Because sometimes you have to celebrate the quiet victories even if no one else understands the punchline, and then I sliced it in my kitchen while reading a long email from Gabriella that ended with a single sentence that felt like a key turning in a rusted lock. He is weeks from missing a covenant and no one wants to tell him. I set down the knife and felt the kind of calm that clicks into place when a plan moves from theory to schedule. And while the frosting dried into a sugary crust, I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it with a name that would have sounded melodramatic to anyone who did not live inside this particular story. By the time the weekend rolled around and the family chat began its usual blizzard of photos and harmless invitations that always felt like polite surveillance, I had already scheduled 2 more meetings. One with a supplier who was tiring of being paid in apologies, and another with a quiet investor who liked the taste of undervalued assets. And although none of this would look like revenge to a casual observer scrolling past a snapshot of my mother's potted basil, I knew I had just taken the first piece off his board, a single clean move that forces your opponent to play your game without realizing the rules have changed. When my phone buzzed with a text from David asking if I had finally found a real job and whether I needed him to talk to someone at his firm to place me in a role with training wheels, I smiled in a way that would have unsettled him if he had seen it. Because the question I wanted to ask was not whether he could help me get a job, but whether he had any idea who was about to become his boss, and although it was far too early to say those words out loud, it was not too early to act like they were already true, which is a different kind of power entirely. And when Gabriella forwarded me a calendar invite for a Monday morning pipeline call that included the words emergency alignment, I closed my laptop slowly, the way you close a door you plan to open again in a very different mood, and I thought, with an almost tender clarity, that the shadow I had lived in for years was about to change direction, and that he would not know why until the moment he finally looked up and recognized my shoes on the other side of the table. The deeper I dug into the quiet cracks running through David's empire, the more I realized that what had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress was little more than scaffolding dressed up as marble. And though from a distance it dazzled with its lights and glossy press releases, from close-up it trembled at every gust of scrutiny. I began to notice how his announcements always came on Thursdays, strategically timed to overshadow whispers of layoffs or the sudden departures of mid-level managers, and how he inflated routine vendor renewals into triumphs of negotiation. The game he played depended on people never looking too closely, and unfortunately for him I had both the patience and the appetite to look at every line, every filing, every whisper that had been shoved to the corners of the industry. One afternoon, I found myself rereading a financial disclosure 3 times, staring at the same set of numbers that stubbornly refused to add up. The discrepancy wasn't enormous, not the kind that made headlines, but it was enough to make me pause, enough to tell me that somewhere in the machinery the gears weren't locking as cleanly as they should. Later that week, when I had coffee with a supplier who had been doing business with David's company for years, I listened carefully as his tone shifted from the polite small talk of invoices to the cautious confession of a man who had been paid late one too many times. He leaned across the table, lowered his voice, and told me that while he still got his money eventually, the delays had grown longer, and the excuses more rehearsed. His words carried the weight of someone beginning to reconsider loyalty, and I knew I had found the first tremor of opportunity. The thing about watching a powerful man like my brother stumble is that he will do everything in his power to make the stumble look like a dance. He had mastered the art of spinning near misses into heroic recoveries, of convincing his employees that frantic late-night calls were evidence of his tireless dedication rather than the sign of a crumbling structure. But what he could not control was the quiet erosion of trust that spread underneath him, the fatigue of his managers, the bitterness of his vendors, and the wary calculations of his partners. And as I pieced together the fragments of gossip, public filings, and offhand remarks, a picture began to emerge, a picture not of catastrophe but of fragility, which in many ways was more dangerous. It was around this time that I ran into Marcus, an old contact who had once shared a cubicle with me back when we were both just trying to make rent. He now worked at a firm that specialized in restructuring underperforming companies, and over drinks he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his team had been watching David's numbers for months. They weren't ready to swoop in, but they were circling, and their interest confirmed what I already suspected, that beneath the veneer of strength, David's company was wobbling. I didn't reveal my intentions to Marcus. I simply asked questions, listened carefully, and filed away every detail. Information, after all, was the currency I valued most, and I had learned that spending it too early was the surest way to lose leverage. What gave me the most clarity, however, was a conversation with an employee who had left quietly, without the usual angry posts or bitter farewell emails. I found her through a mutual acquaintance, and when I asked about her time under David's leadership, she laughed in that hollow way people do when the truth has burned them. She told me about the endless promises of promotions that never materialized, the culture of fear that kept people silent, and the sense that everyone was running on fumes while David strutted through meetings, convinced that charisma alone could keep the lights on. I remember leaving that conversation with the distinct impression that my brother's empire was not only faltering financially, but also rotting from within, and I could not shake the thought that the very people he dismissed as replaceable were quietly sharpening their knives. It was not enough to know his weaknesses. I needed to time my move so that it landed with precision. A premature strike could be brushed off as petty sibling rivalry, a vendetta that would only reinforce the family narrative that I was bitter and jealous. But if I waited until the ground was already unsteady, my push would not only topple him but also look inevitable, as though I had merely accelerated what was already bound to happen. So I watched, and I waited, and with every new whisper of unpaid invoices, every new resignation, and every subtle downgrade in industry chatter, I felt the moment drawing closer. There was a night, late in autumn, when I sat at my desk surrounded by notes, contracts, and half-empty coffee cups, and for the first time the plan took on a shape so solid I could almost touch it. I wasn't just looking to wound him or prove him wrong in front of our parents. I wanted something permanent, something that would shift the power dynamic forever. I wanted to own the ground he walked on, to make him look up one day and realize that the person he had mocked at family dinners was now the one holding the keys to everything he thought untouchable. The realization both thrilled and frightened me. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was strategy, it was business, and it was power. And as the rain tapped against the window that night, I knew with absolute certainty that the opening I needed had finally revealed itself, and once I stepped through it, there would be no turning back. The first contract I signed under my new company letterhead did not look like revenge, at least not to anyone who has never understood that paperwork can be a blade if you know how to hold it. because on the surface it was only a modest advisory agreement with a discreet clause that allowed me to convert a portion of unpaid fees into equity should the client fail to meet dates that we both knew were aggressive in the way a storm pretends it will pass without hitting your roof. And once the ink dried, I felt the peculiar quiet that follows a decisive move, the hush of a chess piece clicking into place even though the person across the board is still telling a funny story and has not seen what you just opened up. I assembled a small triangle of allies whose names would mean nothing to my family and very little to the industry at large, yet whose signatures carried access to gray corners where distressed assets change hands without press releases. And together we started buying slivers that looked harmless on paper, warrants tucked inside vendor settlements, a convertible note from a lender who wanted out before anyone asked awkward questions, an employee stock grant from a tired operations lead who said she would rather see her kids' college funds stop sweating than keep waiting for a phantom payday that never quite reached the bank. Each piece was tiny enough to be deniable, but together they formed a narrow bridge across a canyon that David had been pretending was a decorative pond. I kept my head down and my voice soft, and when my mother called to remind me about Aunt Lila's birthday brunch and asked in that strange, cheerful tone whether I had thought any more about asking David to mentor me toward a stable career path, I assured her I was doing just fine, and then returned to the spreadsheet where a tab labeled weather, purely for my own amusement, tracked the timing of his cash flow like seasonal wind. While he posted a photo with a golf buddy and a caption about crushing another quarter, I signed a small agreement that looked like a bandage for a supplier's bruised patience, but would later become the thread that unraveled a larger contract. And, because I have no interest in hurting people who never laughed at me over dinner, I built a safety net into that bandage so the supplier could roll into my network without losing a night's sleep, which felt less like cruelty and more like cleaning up after someone else's parade, a task I happened to be very good at. The revenge in that moment was not loud, yet it was exquisitely shaped. By protecting his supplier while creating an exit ramp, I loosened the cornerstone he had been leaning on, and when their deliveries resumed under my terms a few weeks later, the calendar entry on his side read delay resolved while mine read leverage established, which is the kind of semantic difference that decides who gets to keep the lights on. The next move came courtesy of an investor whose portfolio smiled on the outside and flinched on the inside, a man who had tolerated David's theater because the quarterly deck wore a suit and said reassuring words, and who now wanted a quiet path to dignity without the splash of a rescue. We structured a preference stack that looked like a gentle shuffle yet tilted the room in my direction. And when the papers were filed, it gave me the ability to call a meeting that would not look like an ambush until the door closed. I admit there were nights when I lay awake wondering whether the part of me that had spent years wanting to be seen for the right reasons had just given the wheel to a leaner, colder version who collected signatures like trophies. But whenever doubt tried to sink its teeth into my certainty, I remembered the way his laughter had sounded across the table while my father smiled and my mother reached for the salt, and the mental tape of that noise was better than caffeine. I did not want to destroy him for the thrill of it. I wanted the lesson carved into stone, the memory of what it feels like to mistake volume for value, and the only way to teach it to a man like David was to take away the stage. My second small revenge of that month arrived wrapped in a resigning accountant's neat handwriting, because when she decided she was done explaining impossible timelines with pleasant emails, she sold me her unvested options for a price that would not buy a luxury weekend. And with those crumbs I crossed an arbitrary threshold that allowed me to request information he never believed I would see. It was not a takeover, not yet. But it was the difference between watching a play from the balcony and walking backstage to find the wires and the buckets of glitter, and once I stood there I could see exactly how the next scene needed to go. I scheduled a board update under the polite pretext of alignment on creditor communications, moved it to a different location under the convenient excuse of renovations, and arrived early enough to feel the air in the room. That peculiar blend of stale coffee and unspoken suspicion that lives in every conference suite where numbers are about to tell on people. David swept in with 2 minutes to spare, wearing a smile that had closed many rooms and opened many wallets, and for a breath I saw the brother who once tried to teach me to ride a bike by holding the seat and then letting go too early. shouting that falling was part of learning while I watched the pavement rush up. He slid into the chair he always assumed would be his, greeted each director by name, and launched into a summary of pipeline momentum that sounded like music if you were not listening to the percussion section where the rhythm kept stuttering. And when he finished with a flourish about strategic optionality, I thanked him in a friendly voice and opened a folder with the stack of consents that had quietly shifted the weather since the last time he checked. The room tilted by a degree so imperceptible that only people who have waited years for balance to recalibrate would notice, and as he frowned at the first page, I described in calm sentences how the preference stack had been reweighted by a recent transaction, how the warrant pool now enjoyed a consolidated representation provision, and how, given those facts, the board would be entertaining a motion to appoint interim executive leadership for a period defined by a set of milestones we would review together after lunch. I did not say the word fired, because it is a blunt instrument and I now preferred scalpels, but I did say immediate transition with continued consultation availability, which in business is the same sentence written in a nicer font. His eyes finally found my name where it had not belonged before, and for the first time in our lives he looked at me without the protective lens of older brother superiority, and, while he prepared the speech he has always relied on, the one about loyalty and family and stepping stones, I gently placed a single sheet on top of the stack that contained a signature he respected even more than his own, the investor's, and then another with the supplier's acknowledgement that deliveries would continue uninterrupted under new terms, and finally a third with the accountant's attestation that the covenant would be met under my plan and missed under his. He exhaled through his nose in that way he does when anger burns a hole straight through his composure, and I almost felt sorry for him, not because he did not deserve the impact, but because he had never learned the pleasure of listening long enough to hear the truth before the music stops. The vote request slid across the table like a quiet tide, and while he protested and tried to summon the old gravity, the director's eyes betrayed the same decision I had reached months ago, that panic is not leadership and charisma is not collateral. And when the first I landed it sounded unremarkable, the way decisive moments often do, yet it rearranged the furniture of our entire family story. I kept my hands flat on the table and my voice measured while I read the transition paragraph, and although I offered him the dignity of a consultancy that would never be used, the document in my palm made it clear his keycard would stop working that afternoon. He stared at me as though I had stolen a childhood secret and turned it into currency, and perhaps I had, yet the most surprising thing was the calm in my chest, because the person I had once hoped would defend me had finally learned I did not need a defender. The door clicked as someone brought in lunch we would not eat, and somewhere down the hall a printer began spitting out pages that would change where his name appeared on the organizational chart, and I said, as gently as a person can while pulling a root from the ground, that the board would reconvene in 15 minutes to finalize the appointment, at which point he stood very still and asked me a question that made the room briefly tilt again, because it was not about the company at all but about our father, and whether I planned to tell him before dinner. I did not answer, not yet, because the final motion had not been read, and because the last piece of this needed to land without the cushion of family, so I closed the folder slowly, looked him in the eyes, and invited the directors to step out for a brief recess, which left the two of us in the quiet where truth has nowhere to hide. When the directors filed back into the room with the careful faces of people who have already decided but want to look as though they are still listening, I felt a steadiness rise in me that did not feel like triumph or rage or even satisfaction, but something quieter and far more dangerous, a certainty that the person I had been rehearsing in silence had finally stepped out from behind the curtain and found her mark, and when the vote concluded with the soft, bureaucratic hum of voices saying a single syllable that might as well have been a bell tolling, I read the motion in a tone I saved for truths that had earned the right to be spoken slowly, and ended with the line that would be quoted back to me for years by people who were not in the room. The one about immediate transition, continued consultation availability, and keycard deactivation by close of business, which is a polite way to say the word fired without getting any on your shoes. David stared at me as though I had pulled a rabbit from a hat using a trick he had personally invented, and for a heartbeat I thought he would lunge across the table and try to grab back the old world, but he only adjusted his cufflink and asked if I intended to make this personal. At which point I reminded him, gently and with more grace than he had ever once offered me, that business is always personal when it is funded with family myths, and that this decision had been made by math long before it was delivered by me. I did not enjoy the moment of handing him the envelope with the consultancy terms and the scripted language about dignity, because while revenge can be delicious, it is also heavy, and I have never liked meals that sit in the stomach like regret. So I simply placed it on the table and slid the signed supplier guarantees beside it, along with the investor's consent and the accountant's covenant plan, and then I closed the folder and thanked him for his years of service, which felt absurd to say. To the boy who once let go of my bicycle seat and told me not to make a big deal out of falling, yet here we were, adults playing an old scene with new props, and as he stood to leave he asked, in a voice that finally sounded human, whether I planned to tell our parents before dinner, which, as questions go, was both sentimental and strategic, because he wanted witnesses in a room where I prefer evidence. I told him I would call them on the drive, and this time I did not say it like a promise or a threat, but like a fact that no longer needed permission, and he nodded in that stiff way men nod when they are swallowing pride without water, then walked out past the reception desk where the flowers were starting to bend under their own perfume. And I watched his shoulders try to remember what it feels like to carry something other than applause. The meeting dissolved into logistics and applause no one meant, and once the directors had shaken my hand and used the phrase steady hand twice more than was necessary, I sat alone in that expensive quiet and let the echo of my own voice catch up with me, because I needed to hear what I had done with no one narrating it back, and when the phone buzzed with my mother's name, I let it ring long enough to breathe twice before answering, and in that small pause I realized that the next act would not be about contracts or covenants or even power, but about the mirror I had just held up to a family that had only ever wanted a picture where the lighting made the son look heroic and the daughter look grateful. My mother began with worry dressed as love, asking if I had said something I might regret because David had texted her the word unbelievable followed by a string of punctuation that made him look like a teenager rather than a chief executive, and I told her, as gently as a person can when the truth has waited too long, that I had assumed custody of a company that needed someone who could count without flinching, and that David would be fine if he learned to listen, which, if we were being honest, might take longer than the quarter he had promised the world. She said my father would be devastated, and I said he would be disappointed until he remembered the difference between loving a child and defending a record, and she went very quiet and asked me to come to dinner anyway. Because families eat even when their stories change. I arrived late on purpose because lateness diffuses a certain kind of theater, and when I walked into the dining room that had been the stage for so many small humiliations, I saw my father holding a glass of red wine like a stamp he was not sure he wanted to use, while my mother braced both palms on the table as if steadying a ship in high wind. And David sat in the chair he claimed since childhood with a posture that announced nothing had changed even as his eyes kept flicking to the doorway, as if waiting for a bailiff, and for a moment no one spoke, which was almost funny given how much talking had been done in this room at my expense. My father asked if it was true, and I said it was truer than anything that had preceded it, and he said he wished I had talked to them first, and I asked whether anyone had ever listened when I did. And in the silence that followed, I heard the sound of a myth cracking, not shattering, just opening enough for air to get in, and I almost reached for his hand, except that sympathy felt like treason to the person I had become in order to survive them. I did not grandstand, did not list my quiet years of diligence like a prosecuting attorney, did not shove the envelope of consultancy terms across the family table as if it were a trophy, because the point had never been to make a spectacle in this room. The point had been to move the center of gravity so that when the laughter began again it would not land where I was sitting, and instead I told my brother that there was a desk waiting for him in a smaller office with a door that opened directly to a hallway rather than a balcony view, and that he would be paid fairly to advise on relationships he had not completely burned. and that if he wanted to learn the weight of a quiet yes, he could come in on Monday, and I would introduce him to the people who built his best quarters while he wrote the captions, which was both generous and its opposite, a gift and a sentence at the same time. He laughed once in that brittle way that makes the air feel thin, asked whether I had finally gotten what I wanted, and I told him I had gotten what the company needed, which did not answer his questions so much as escort it to the door, because what I wanted was more complicated and less virtuous. A blend of justice and vanity that I am not proud of but will not deny, and when he pushed back his chair and said he would see me in the morning if he felt like it, my mother whispered his name with the same softness she once used to call us in from the street at dusk. The night ended not with a toast or a fight, but with a pile of dishes in the sink and the sound of the dishwasher starting up like an exhausted tide, and while my parents stood together at the counter in the uneasy alliance of people rearranging their story on the fly. I kissed my mother's cheek and told my father that learning to be proud of the quiet child might take practice, then stepped out into air that smelled like rain even though the sky was clear, and I drove to the office I now owned, with the strange awareness that victory is a room with bad lighting if you stand in the wrong corner. I unlocked my new door and sat at the desk that used to be his, and for a long time I did nothing except listen to the building breathe, which is what old machines do when no one is asking them to perform. And I wondered whether the part of me that waited all those years for fairness had just traded one stage for another, and whether teaching him this lesson had taught me something I would rather not know. The phone vibrated with a single text from an unknown number that simply said, "You were right about the covenant," and I smiled in a way that felt like a confession, then opened the window to let the night in. Because somewhere below a delivery truck hissed and backed into the bay, and work would start again at dawn, and I would have to decide whether I was the kind of boss who believes in mercy or balance sheets, or whether those are only different doorways to the same long hallway, at the end of which my brother might be waiting with an expression I have not yet learned how to answer.